Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the source material to extract the most challenging, revolutionary, and necessary ideas in philosophy and history. Today, we are taking a monumental journey back to the 17th century to really dissect the mind of Baruch Spinoza. We're focusing on his incredibly seminal and frankly dangerous work, Theologico-Political Treatise.
It's an absolute lightning rod of a text. Spinoza was often called the God-intoxicated man.
Right.
And in the same breath, the era's most notorious atheist.
Right.
And it was all because of the very same ideas.
It's an amazing paradox.
It is. His project was just monumental. He was trying to provide a systematic foundation for rational thought that could, logically and just inevitably dissolve the very roots of human conflict, superstition, and tyranny.
Absolutely. And our deep dive today is really focused on that core conviction of his, this idea that intellect and rigorous, just uncompromising reason are the only reliable guides for human action, that they can steer us toward increasing our humanity, our dignity, and crucially, peace. We're unpacking a work that isn't just a historical curiosity. This is one of the earliest, most robust defenses of intellectual freedom and free speech in the entire Western canon.
And to really appreciate the power of his political argument, you absolutely have to start with his cosmology. I mean, the immediate radical concept that anchors this entire system is his fusion of God and nature.
Okay.
Spinoza's metaphysics, it really forms the non-negotiable basis for everything he argues later, whether that's, a political treatise on free speech or an ethical guide on how to live a good life. He just rejects centuries of dualism in one swift, logical move.
That sets the perfect framework, and I think we should prepare you, the listener, for a demanding exploration. Spinoza requires really detailed logical reasoning. This is a journey into what he calls intellectual perfection, and it offers a toolkit not just for history enthusiasts, but for anyone seeking a more cosmic, less personal way to view existence. All right, let's get into the engine room of Spinoza's thought. I think we have to start with that that truly mind-bending equation.
God is nature.
Exactly. God is nature, but it's so important to get this right from the start. This isn't just a gentle pantheistic feeling about the world.
Oh, not at all. It's not just, the trees are God. It's far, far more rigorous than simple pantheism.
So what does he mean by it then?
Spinoza establishes that God, or what he calls substance, is nature. But we have to understand this as the entire cosmos seen from a universal cosmic point of view.
Okay, a cosmic point of view.
Yes. When Spinoza uses the term God, he means the ultimate, infinite, and necessarily existing substance. And when he uses nature, he means that exact same substance, just expressed in its entirety.
So the distinction between the creator and the created just disappears.
It vanishes. It's replaced by one singular reality.
And from there, the philosophical architecture really starts to rise. If God is this ultimate substance, he has to be defined by infinite perfection.
Right.
And if God is infinitely perfect, then his creation of the universe must be, and this is the key word, necessary. What's the logical chain that gets him to absolute necessity?
Well, if God is the most perfect being, he can't possess an arbitrary will. A God with an arbitrary will, one who could choose to create this way or that way, that implies a God who is capable of making a choice that is less than perfect.
So choice itself is a sign of imperfection.
In this context, yes. If he's perfect, he can't act out of constraint and he can't act out of caprice. Therefore, everything that flows from God's nature, which is everything that exists, it must happen necessarily. It has to follow these immutable, eternal laws. The universe doesn't happen because God decided it would. The universe happens because it's logically impossible for God, being what he is, to not express himself in this specific deterministic way.
Wow. That's an incredibly elegant philosophical constraint, and it just immediately obliterates entire fields of traditional theology.
It does.
Any traditional view of God that suggests he could, spontaneously alter the laws of physics or intervene to change the outcome of a battle, that implies he must have made a mistake when he set up the initial rules.
Exactly. For Spinoza, if causality, the natural law, contradicts itself even one time, the whole idea of an infinitely perfect God just collapses.
And this leads him straight to his critique of miracles.
A total, uncompromising critique. Miracles are, to him, nonsensical. They would require God to break his own nature, which is just synonymous with the immutable order of the cosmos. To believe in a miracle, Spinoza argues, is to believe that God is less perfect than the eternal laws he embodies.
I find his redefinition of the miracle so insightful, and it really gets to the heart of human psychology. He says that what people call a miracle is just a natural phenomenon that is not understood by the person reporting it.
And he digs into why they report them. People crave to believe that they are so individually special that this immense universal substance would break its necessary structure just for them. It's an act of, well, egocentric superstition.
Right.
The person who attributes something to a miracle instead of looking for the natural mechanical cause is basically asserting that God is capricious, that he acts only according to human interests, which Spinoza just calls absurd and contradictory to God's nature.
This means Spinoza's God is, in a traditional sense, surprisingly passive. He's not an active agent who listens to prayers or grants wishes or intervenes in human affairs.
No, not at all. Spinoza sees God as the purposeless causality itself, the eternal, immutable, self-sufficient structure of existence.
And this leads us directly to the concept of one substance.
Exactly. Spinoza divides reality into three core concepts. You have substance, attributes, and modes. Substance is God, or nature, the infinite, self-sufficient reality. We, as limited things, are the modes.
So we are modes.
We are the affections, or you could say the temporary expressions, of that one substance.
And what are the attributes then?
The attributes are the ways in which the infinite substance expresses its essence. God has infinite attributes, but we as humans can only perceive two of them, thought and extension.
Extension meaning?
Matter.
Exactly.
Matter. So every single thing that exists is either a mode of the attribute of thought, like an idea or a mind, or a mode of the attribute of extension, like a body or a rock, or, in our case, both at the same time.
So the chair I'm sitting on and the thought I'm having right now about Spinoza, they're both equally, literally, parts of God.
Literally.
Yeah.
We are all finite expressions of an infinite reality.
This absolute monism, then, dictates the total determinism of the universe.
It has to. If there's only one substance, and that substance acts out of absolute necessity, then everything that happens, the collision of atoms, the rise of a philosophy, your decision to listen to this deep dive right now, it's all necessary.
Which means the conventional notion of free will is...
It's an illusion. It's an illusion that arises from our ignorance of the true causes of our actions. God, as the totality of all existence, has no power to influence anything that happens, because he is the happening.
That is a challenging concept for anyone steeped in the idea of moral agency. If everything is necessary and determined, doesn't that make the universe feel cold, or worse, meaningless? How does he derive any kind of ethics from sheer necessary determinism?
It does remove the anthropomorphic, the judgmental quality from God, which makes him less available for personal prayer.
Sure.
But Spinoza argues this actually makes God more perfect, because he is perfectly rational and coherent. The ethical task for us isn't to change what is necessary, because we can't. It's to understand it.
And that understanding changes things for us.
It does. This brings us to the psychological consequence of adopting what he calls the cosmic viewpoint.
The sources refer to this effect as being a little like Zen or Enlightenment. If you really grasp that you are just a finite mode in an infinite, perfect, necessary chain of being, how does that shift your emotional landscape?
It provides an immediate ethical and emotional correction. If God encompasses all that is, focusing on personal, fleeting emotional problems, the stress of a deadline, the pain of a personal offense, a lost promotion, it all becomes illogical and irrational.
Because those problems, while they feel very real to me, the mode.
Right, they are real to you.
Yeah.
But they are insignificant and totally necessary from the universal perspective.
The shift is profound because it forces us out of that hyper-personal viewpoint. When you adopt the universal cosmic perspective, you recognize that all conscious beings are equally modes of God. This knowledge, this intellectual perfection, is, for Spinoza, the highest good.
It's the only thing that genuinely frees us from what he calls the bondage of our unstable passions. The universe is deterministic, but our understanding of that necessity is what provides genuine intellectual freedom and tranquility.
And underpinning this whole necessary universe is a fundamental drive of existence itself, right? Conatus.
Yes, conatus, a Latin term for struggle or effort. It's the inherent striving of all things, whether it's a mind or a body, to persevere in its own being. It is the inertia of existence.
So he takes a physical principle and applies it to psychology.
Exactly. It's the law of self-preservation, but for everything. When this drive is understood clearly, it manifests as intellectual perfection. When it's misunderstood or when we're driven by external causes we don't understand, it manifests as those unstable passions like fear or greed.
And this insight, this core drive to persist, is just extraordinarily influential.
Oh, massively. You can trace its lineage all through subsequent philosophy. It's not just a footnote.
So who picks it up?
Well, Schopenhauer takes this blind, inherent effort to persist, and he elevates it to the cosmic metaphysical concept of the will, the engine of all suffering.
Right, the will to live.
Exactly. Then Nietzsche internalizes that driving force, and he sharpens it into the will to power, the striving for self-overcoming and growth.
And even later, Heidegger,
Later still, uses this idea of the inherent persistence of being to develop his concept of care, or Sorge, the fundamental way human beings relate to existence. Spinoza essentially identified the foundational energy that drives not just physics, but all subsequent continental philosophy dealing with human desire and existential purpose.
that unifies the whole system. Okay, now that we have this necessary deterministic cosmos and the fundamental drive of conatus, we can move to the next logical step, applying this rigorous rationalism to the messiness of human society and the roots of political disorder.
Right, because if the universe is perfectly ordered by God nature, then disorder must, by definition, come from within us, from our incomplete understanding of that necessity. And Spinoza's treatise begins with this powerful diagnosis of why people are constantly at war with themselves and each other. And it starts with superstition.
He immediately hits the root cause with that memorable opening line. Men would never be superstitious if they could govern all their circumstances by set rules or if they were always favored by fortune.
It's an economic and a psychological diagnosis all rolled into one. Superstition is born out of instability. It thrives in periods of acute doubt and uncertainty, especially when, as he puts it, hope and fear are struggling for the mastery.
So when we feel out of control.
Exactly. When humans feel incapable of controlling their environment through reason or established rules, they desperately seek external, non-rational sources of comfort, prediction, and control. It is fundamentally, as he says, engendered, preserved, and fostered by fear.
And this leads him to identify the core human problem, not strictly as a lack of knowledge, but a profound lack of self-control. This seems to suggest that rational knowledge alone isn't enough to save us from irrational behavior.
He makes a crucial distinction here between general knowledge and self-knowledge. He states that while the general fact that human beings are often irrational is widely known, quote, though few, I believe, know their own nature.
So even the smart people are still susceptible.
Especially them, in some ways. Even those who possess general intellectual knowledge, the intellectual elites, they are often still just modes of substance being driven by external, uncontrollable emotional behavior. Their conatus is misdirected. They might philosophize about perfect necessity, but they still lash out in anger when they lose status or when their plans fail.
This brings up the modern critique often leveled against Spinoza, that he's profoundly elitist. If he seems to look down on the common people, the sources argue his true, most venomous target isn't the poor and uneducated.
No, it's the existing political and theological elite.
Right, the ones who are supposedly wise but lack self-control.
This is a critique aimed decisively upwards. He points out that superstition's chief victims are those persons who greedily covet temporal advantages and are in prosperity.
The successful people.
Yes, the powerful people who are so overbrimming with wisdom during good times that they reject all counsel, yet at the first sign of distress, they're the ones who implore help from God with what he calls prayers and womanish tears. It's a deep dig at the hypocrisy of the powerful.
And the specific historical example he uses is so telling. He doesn't pick some ignorant farmer. He uses Alexander the Great,
The ultimate political elite, the conqueror,
as his example of superstitious behavior because Alexander was known to constantly seek advice from seers and fortune tellers before a battle.
And by choosing Alexander, Spinoza is elevating philosophy above both religion and politics. It is the vantage point from which you can judge the irrationality and emotional instability of the highest rulers and the highest priests. It's an argument for the supreme practical utility of true reason.
This focus sets the stage for what Spinoza sees as this perpetual societal war between the priestly caste, the theologians and prophets, and the warrior, or political caste, the rulers and kings.
Yeah, they're fighting over who gets to govern the masses' emotions.
It's a brutally Machiavellian political analysis tucked right into a philosophical treatise.
It is. Spinoza observes that prophets become most formidable to rulers precisely when the state is in the most peril, because the superstitious masses, they turn to those who promise divine intervention when the state can't provide stability.
Which translates into this stark, almost timeless warning to the political elite. Statesmen, either satisfy the common people or forfeit your right to rule to the prophets and their theologians.
The underlying struggle is over the identity of the creative one. For the religious caste, the creative power belongs to God and those who speak for him. For the political pietist, it's the prince, who enforces order through strength. But for rationalists like Spinoza, the true architect of social order and human dignity, the bringer of new modes and orders, it must be the philosopher.
The one who provides rational understanding.
Exactly. This is a claim for philosophical sovereignty.
And here we come to this profoundly dark, yet perhaps necessary, observation about the masses themselves. Spinoza delivers what the sources call a terrifyingly memorable passage, where he suggests that the mass of mankind remains always at about the same pitch of misery.
And is always best pleased by a novelty which has not yet proved elusive.
It's a bleak outlook.
It is a dark prognosis, but it's rooted in his deterministic metaphysics. Because the majority of people are driven by unstable, externalized emotions, hope and fear, that misdirected conatus, they are perpetually dissatisfied. No ruler, no system, no remedy ever satisfies them for long. They just chase novelty, only to find it elusive. They are, in the long run, politically and emotionally unsatisfiable.
That observation, if you accept it, is a massive challenge to the entire Enlightenment project. If the ultimate goal is universal enlightenment and dignity, but the vast majority of people are perpetually driven by these uncontrollable emotions, what does this imply for Spinoza's vision of peace? Is the pursuit of the highest good intellectual knowledge just inherently doomed to be an isolated, esoteric path taken by only a few philosophers?
It forces a hard political pivot. If universal reason is impossible for the majority, then the task of the statesman is to create a political structure that can manage the consequences of perpetual emotionality, rather than relying on philosophical conversion.
And to manage that emotionality.
To manage it, Spinoza realized he had to neuter the most potent source of irrational authority, organized theology. And this is where Section 3 comes in.
This is where Spinoza gets incredibly controversial and methodical, pioneering a method of biblical criticism that was centuries ahead of its time. He seeks a third way when dealing with the relationship between reason and revelation.
Right. Traditionally, philosophers and theologians had struggled with whether reason or scripture held the ultimate authority. One school, with thinkers like Augustine and Maimonides, argued that if scripture contradicted reason, it must be interpreted allegorically. Reason was supreme.
And the other side?
The opposing school, you see this with Luther or the Islamic scholar al-Ghazali, argued that reason must be subservient. If human reason seemed to conflict with divine revelation, well, human reason was flawed. Revelation was supreme.
And Spinoza says they're both wrong.
He rejects both because both systems force philosophy and theology into conflict. And that ultimately destabilizes the state by allowing priests or philosophers to claim political supremacy. So Spinoza seeks to divorce them.
Into completely separate, non-conflicting realms.
Based on their entirely different goals and methodologies.
Okay, let's detail those distinct goals. What is the pragmatic purpose of theology and revelation, according to Spinoza?
Its purpose is purely pragmatic and social. It is meant to inspire simple obedience and piety in the people. Its doctrines have to be clear, easily understood, and focus on action. Its aim is to render men not learned, because learning requires complex metaphysics, but simply obedient.
So it's about behavior.
It's about behavior. It's about commitment to practical virtues, especially justice and love toward one's neighbor.
And how does that contrast with philosophy?
Philosophy's purpose is entirely different. Its goal is the pursuit of truth and understanding, which leads to intellectual perfection and the rational knowledge of God or nature. Philosophy is complex, it requires long, rigorous study, and its goal is understanding, not behavioral compliance.
This means that theological doctrines don't actually have to be metaphysically true.
Not at all.
They just have to be socially effective. That is a radical claim.
It's the ultimate pragmatic defense of religion. Since theology's goal is mere obedience, its necessary dogmas, which he boils down to only a few basic rules for salvation, they don't have to align with the intellectual truth of the universe. They just have to be effective for inculcating obedience and mutual love.
So the philosopher knows the truth, but recognizes religious doctrine as a useful tool for the masses.
Precisely. And this framework explains his analysis of Scripture itself. He argues that the Bible was written primarily for the entire people, and therefore its content had to be adapted to the deficient understanding and the powerful imaginations of the masses.
He is devastatingly direct here. He points out that scriptures attribute hands, feet, eyes, and even human emotions like anger or regret to God.
Right. It describes God as corporeal, speaking according to the utterly deficient understanding of the common people. The prophets were forced to communicate in a way that resonated with the common imagination, using stories, visual imagery, and anthropomorphic language.
So a philosopher who judges things from pure intellect has to recognize these statements as necessary adaptations, not as literal descriptions of reality.
Exactly. And he counters the traditional theologians who try to interpret every corporeal description of God metaphorically. He argues that if the Bible were meant to be read as some complex allegory, it would have only been composed for the most learned few. The very fact that the Bible functions as a political and social text proves that it must be taken, on its face, as a narrative adapted to a common, unphilosophical intelligence.
So this brings us to the method of interpretation. If we are to understand the Bible not as divine dictation, but as a human narrative, how should we analyze it?
We must interpret Scripture using the natural light of reason. This natural light is the only authority, not some external political or church power, and certainly not some light above nature.
And what does that mean in practice?
It means we must analyze Scripture like any other historical document. Through philology, considering the history of the Hebrew people, analyzing the language and the intended audience.
This method lets him engage in specific, detailed biblical criticism.
Oh, yes. He treats the Pentateuch, for instance, not as the inerrant word dictated to Moses, but as a Hebrew narrative compiled long after Moses by an ancient author. He thinks likely Ezra, who skillfully gathered national sources to create an enduring national identity.
So he's treating it like a history book, not a holy book.
Essentially, yes.
Yes.
He even suggests that seemingly miraculous events, like the plagues of Egypt, can easily be explained by natural causes. Strong winds bringing swarms of locusts or frogs, which the common people then interpreted as divine intervention.
So by systematically deconstructing the inerrancy of the Bible, he's reducing its authority from a divine truth that must be obeyed without question
to a human historical document adapted for the purpose of obedience. And that is a critical political move.
It's the absolute crux of the argument leading to his political conclusion.
It is. If the Bible is accepted as fallible, as a product of man, and its primary purpose is just obedience, then neither the political elite nor the masses will feel the divine compulsion to silence those who interpret it differently or who disagree with it philosophically.
What about the prophets themselves? How does he reconcile their sincere claims of divine command with his deterministic view of nature?
He argues they aren't necessarily liars. They're doing what they do for the sake of teaching others how to live. He calls them great philosophers for common people.
Okay.
But the command they receive from God is a mode of the substance, coming from the prophet's imagination itself, which is part of nature. The visions they see are internal psychological phenomena, interpreted through their national culture and temperament. It is human psychology, driven by conatus, to seek God and worship Him, and the prophets channel this urge into a communal moral imperative.
Before we move to the final political argument, we should probably touch on the philosophical difference between Spinoza and Hobbes on this point.
Yes, it's a fine point distinction, but it's essential. Hobbes was a materialist who saw the universe as purely mechanical, but he still upheld a traditional dualism. God was a superior substance existing above the natural world.
Which allowed for miracles.
Exactly. That gap allowed Hobbes to maintain that miracles were possible, serving as proof of God's power and therefore useful for establishing political authority. Spinoza, with his monism, God is nature, he closes that gap entirely. For Spinoza, a miracle isn't proof of power, it's a logical, necessary contradiction. His system is far more fundamentally rationalist and deterministic than Hobbes's.
So the entire system, from the one substance in metaphysics through the critique of human superstition to the deconstruction of theological authority, it's all a logical, necessary progression leading to Spinoza's ultimate political conclusion.
The absolute defense of intellectual freedom.
He argues that the best, most stable form of government is a representative democracy. Why? Why democracy for him?
Because it's the one closest to the state of nature, where all citizens, by handing over their rights, create a sovereign power that is, at least in theory, the collective will of the people. This near-identical relationship between the people and the government, he thinks, leads to the broadest support for the state's power and therefore stability.
He describes this as an absolutist democracy, which sounds like a fundamental paradox. How can a state be both democratic and absolute? And where do the limits of power truly lie?
This is a crucial area to unpack. The The paradox is resolved by distinguishing between the sovereign's right and the sovereign's prudence. The people, as the collective sovereign, possess the absolute right to place laws and restrictions on actions.
On actions.
On actions, yes. Whatever is necessary for the benefit and preservation of the state. If the sovereign power is truly absolute, its authority over behavior is, in principle, unlimited.
But history shows that absolute sovereignty often devolves into tyranny, whether it's a king or a majority. So how does Spinoza's system protect the individual from this absolute collective power?
This is the radical turning point, and it's where his metaphysics pays off. While the state has absolute right over actions, Spinoza argues that the state should not, and critically, cannot effectively exercise any laws that restrict speech or thought.
Why can't the state control thought? Is that a moral limit or a pragmatic one?
It's primarily a pragmatic limit. It's based on his diagnosis of human nature and that inherent canonis. First, no human can genuinely transfer his right to reason and judge to another person. It's inherent to his being.
You can't give it away.
You can't. And second, trying to suppress opinion, thought, and speech is just counterproductive. Laws designed to make men think alike don't breed consensus. They breed hatred, resentment, and conspiracy, which ultimately destabilizes the state and leads to inevitable revolt.
So stability itself demands intellectual freedom. The state that tries to enforce uniformity of thought is the state that is committing suicide.
It's exactly. The ultimate goal is not philosophical unanimity, which Spinoza knows is impossible given the mass's perpetual dissatisfaction, but social harmony.
Yeah.
People must be governed so they can live in harmony, even while, as he says, openly holding different and contradictory opinions.
This is the essence of his pluralism. What's the explicit agreement the citizen makes with the state then?
The citizen agrees to act according to the common decision, which is established by majority vote and codified into law. If the state passes a law, you must comply with the behavior it demands. But, and this is the essential freedom, you do not agree to judge or think according to that law. The tyranny of the majority can enforce a decision of action demanding obedience, but it cannot and it should not attempt to enforce a decision of opinion, which remains stubbornly individual.
So I have to pay the tax, even if I actively write pamphlets arguing that the tax is unjust and economically foolish.
Yes.
Provided my pamphlets don't incite immediate violence or actual law breaking.
Precisely. You comply with the law because it is necessary for the benefit of the state and for peaceful coexistence. The primary aim of the state is always to preserve itself and foster human dignity. But you are absolutely free to philosophize, to debate, to argue against the law, and to seek to change it through rational, nonviolent means.
What does he define as acceptable speech then?
Anything that does not dissolve society into chaos. So as long as the speech acknowledges and supports the basic validity of the social contract itself.
And this circle closes perfectly back to the biblical criticism. This entire elaborate system, from the necessary God to the fallibility of Scripture, was built to protect this single political principle.
Absolutely. If people believe that the state is governed by absolute divine truth, whether that truth is handed down by a king or a prophet, then dissent isn't just disagreement, it's heresy. And the logical necessity for eliminating heretics becomes paramount.
And by showing the Bible is a human document aimed at obedience.
He removes the divine justification for silencing dissent. And by doing that, he creates the necessary space for freedom and rational debate to flourish.
The ultimate conclusion of the Theologico-Political Treatise is clear. A government that enshrines freedom and democracy isn't just morally good, it's pragmatically the most stable and efficient. It leads to a happier individual and a happier state because it protects the highest human good, the intellectual knowledge of God or nature.
So, to synthesize the journey we've taken, Spinoza provides this coherent, rigorous philosophical system. The necessary deterministic nature of God or substance demands rational investigation through philosophy, and that aims for the highest human good, intellectual perfection. Then, to manage the emotionally unstable masses, he uses revelation, or theology, as a purely pragmatic tool for cultivating obedience and societal peace. And by separating these realms entirely, he creates the necessary logical and political space for representative democracy and guarantees absolute intellectual freedom.
We've watched Spinoza's radical rationalism push from the metaphysical identity of God and nature through a harsh critique of human emotional instability and land squarely on that powerful political conclusion. You must act according to the Commonwealth's law, but you are absolutely free to think, debate, and philosophize.
And that intellectual freedom is the only way to prevent the state from collapsing into self-destructive tyranny.
Spinoza leaves us with the conviction that our highest possible good wholly consists in the intellectual knowledge of God or nature. This is the serene life lived outside the bondage of passion. So we have to ask ourselves one final, challenging, reflective question. If we accept Spinoza's deterministic view that the philosophical life is the only true liberation, but we also accept his finding that the mass of mankind is perpetually emotionally dissatisfied and always at about the same pitch of misery, is the philosophical life inherently and necessarily an isolated esoteric one known only by a few? Or can this rational vision for peace and absolute freedom truly be implemented, managed, and appreciated by all citizens in a democratic state? What do you think?